This is Duke University.
Since Professor Wohnout did such a nice job giving us a long historical overview, which I agree with almost basically everything that he said, I'll just speak for a few minutes and just give us a few sort of ancillary insights that were coming to me. And also maybe try to set the stage a little bit for an American to think about these debates often can seem quite different. We are not used, I don't think, to thinking about Catholic politics or to thinking about Catholicism as having much to say to questions of political or economic order. So it sort of requires an act of translation on our part to understand a European mindset where, in fact, Catholicism for a long time has been that, has been a political doctrine, has been a social doctrine, and one that has actually mattered. Think about in America, this doesn't really become an issue until the election of someone like JFK, who in these famous speeches has to promise that he is not going to govern as a Catholic. In Europe, that looks very different because you've had many people, including elected leaders, who quite transparently did govern as a Catholic and tried to act in terms of papal law or papal social teaching, things like that. And I mean, now it's a parody that became a farce. I mean, I'm sure some of you saw that when this entered American political discourse during the last set of vice presidential debates between Biden and Ryan, two Catholics, there was a short and kind of horrifying debate about Catholic social thought, which basically it was whether or not Jesus was a Democrat or a Republican. So, and I just want to think that in Europe, these traditions genuinely matter. They have inspired politics platforms for a very long time. So the question of Catholic politics in the future of Europe is a really rich one, I think. And when we think about what Catholic social and political thought meant in Europe, I'll first talk a little about what it meant and then a little bit about what it means or what it might not mean. It has for a long time, and this is Professor Wohnout got into this, it sort of rhymed with the Federalist Project. Since Catholics began social and political activism in the late 19th century, they've seen the nation state primarily as an enemy. In most places, in places like France and Germany and even in Italy, the nation-state project viewed the church as its primary enemy, as the primary competitor for the sort of allegiance of its citizens. And in response, Catholics developed a sort of social thought that was tried to be neither nationalist nor socialist, but one that would rely on sort of on non-state groups. So if you look at late 19th century, early 20th century Catholic social thought, what they're interested in, they're very interested in families, which, you know, of course Catholics are interested in families, but if you look at the tradition, they have interesting reasons to be that way, because what is the family? It's a sub-state institution governed according to its own laws, its own principles of natural law. And that's basically the model they tried to expand more broadly. So they were interested in things like the family, they were interested in things like the profession, which they saw as, like the family, an institution that could be governed simultaneously with hierarchy and authority, but also with love and in the interest of the common good. And so in a vision like this, where you see families and professions as central to the social order, the state does not have a big role to play. They saw the state mainly as something that would come in and force fathers to send their kids to secular schools or something like this. And so when you see the development of federalist projects after World War II, Catholics are very used to thinking in these terms. In fact, they had been thinking about non-national ways to organize Europe for decades by that time. So, and this is just to get to, this is another one of Professor Wohnout's theses, but I just want to emphasize that after World War II, this tradition of Catholic and social and political thought mattered really tremendously on the continent. In both domestically, in terms of the way that European welfare states were constructed, but also, as he pointed out, in the development of early European federalism, which was central to the way that Catholics understood the social and political renewal of Europe after World War II. in some ways, it's very shocking, and I was surprised myself when I went back to the sort of Catholic newspapers and journals that were being written after 1945. There was an immense amount of enthusiasm for the European project. In some ways, the situation then was the opposite of now, where now we have lots of Europe, but not much enthusiasm for Europe. Back then, you had a ton of enthusiasm for Europe, but not that much was actually happening in the first few years after World War II. And when you look at even things like, you know, these Christian democratic parties, it was a really interesting political novelty. Most of these parties, actually all these parties are new. They had roots in the past, but they're formed anew. And so you see Catholic politicians and experts explain what are these parties. And so often when they talk about what is a Christian democratic party, they'll talk about federalism, because they see federalism as a whole sort of worldview, not just about the Coal and Steel Commission, but as a way to reinstate non-state powers, like families, like professions, and above the state as well. So I looked at, this is a big deal in Bavaria especially, which has a long tradition, like Austria, of anti-democratic Catholic politics. And when Josef Müller, one of the leaders of the Bavarian Christian Democratic Party, in 1948, talking to Der Spiegel, which is sort of the German Newsweek, if anyone still read Newsweek, and he says, what is this new party? We're a federalist party. And he talks about all the different things that means. It means it's about reclaiming power over education. It's about professions taking control of the economy away from the state and from trade unions, and things like this. So federalism is central to what Catholics were, and it's also then central to what the early Federalist project becomes. The early Federalists, so, you know, Europe as we know it now is really something quite new. I mean, things like the euro and all that was quite recent. But what's important about this early period, I think, is it creates a real sort of European consciousness, because Europe could have been something like NAFTA, something like this, but it's not. It's something much broader and more ideological than that. And if you look at the 1957 Treaty of Rome, it doesn't just say, you know, things about coal and steel. It says we want to work towards an ever more closer union. There's a sort of ideological project in the Treaty of Rome and in early European federalism. And I think Catholics and Catholic politics are utterly central to that. So far, I've just sort of, you know, embellished on what Professor Wohnout has said. And I want to both that there is such a thing as Catholic social and political thought, there was Catholic politics, and that after World War II, it mattered enormously, both on the domestic and the international spheres. But then I want to think about what are the present and future of Catholic politics in Europe, just really briefly, because I think that this starts to collapse well before the 90s. Christian democracy and the Catholic Church in Europe starts to change dramatically in the 1960s when you know, and something that sociologists have found when they looked at Europe, we think of Europe as a largely, now, if you go to Europe, as a largely secular place. And until the 1960s, that was not really the case. As in America, the 50s were quite a religious time in Europe. And the Catholic Church in Europe had a difficult time with what was going on in the 60s. It did not respond in a sort of an always productive way to what happened in Europe in the 1960s. So things like in 1968, when Paul VI, you know, at the height of what we know as 1968, of the student revolution, Paul VI decides it's a good time to announce that the church is against all forms of birth control. Which, you know, Catholics go ballistic over this. You know, in Germany, there's a Catholic Congress every year. And usually I look through them. This is an occupational hazard. I look through all the Catholic Congresses. And the 1968 one, all of a sudden, it is extremely tempestuous. And the one about sexual politics, thousands of people go. And people are shouting from the back. It's a very sort of divisive moment, the Catholic Church in the 1960s. And the Catholic Church reinvents itself as something more like what we know it today. It is a much more global church, as we know. It's not only a European church, it's a church more interested in sexual politics. This is something else that we forget. If you look at the church in the 1940s, 1950s, it's not seen as primarily something interested in sexual politics. It has a family policy, as do a lot of other kind of institutions, but it was not defined by its opposition to abortion, to contraception. That was not such a major part of how the church looked. And after the 60s, it does, and it really doubles down on those things, and it becomes very controversial in Europe. So church attendance really starts to crater beginning in the 60s, and especially since the 90s, even in places like Poland, which are very Catholic. I mean, the number of Poles going to Mass in the last 20 years have gone down by something like 20%. Right now, it's the lowest it has ever been, and or at least since they started collecting these statistics. And there are, on the global level, there are some, everyone loves Pope Francis, things like that. But on the, within Europe, if you look what the church is doing in Europe, the press continues to be quite bad. The Polish episcopate, or the Polish clergy, just released a letter a few months ago, which at least got a lot of press, at least in Europe, which took a very combative approach to what it called gender ideology, which was what it meant basically any kind of LGBTQ or abortion or contraception type things. And this is in the midst of course, these huge scandals over child sexual abuse. And even things like in Germany, this was going on when I was there over the summer. I don't know if you've all heard of Bishop Bling Bling. Yeah, some people know. And so it was this bishop who constructed this unbelievable mansion for himself, and he was forced. It caused a big scandal. He was forced to resign. All these things. So the news for the Catholic Church in Europe does not look especially strong. And I want to mention the EPP, which is in a lot of ways is seen as where Catholic strength remains at the European level. It's become, as this has all been going on, the EPP is becoming much the European People's Party, the biggest party in the European Parliament. It begins in the 70s as quite a Christian democratic phenomenon. It's made up of the 6 Christian democratic parties, the same ones who were involved in early European integration. But since the 70s, it's become less of a Christian democratic organ. You might know it's not in the name. Has become more conservative. I mean, it's basically now a block of conservative parties. For a while, the British Conservative Party, the Tory party, was a member, which is definitely not a federalist party, definitely not a Christian democratic party. Fidesz, which was Professor Wohnout mentioned, is not really a Christian democratic party, is now a part of the EPP. So since the 60s, Christian democracy has sort of crumbled in a number of different ways. It has become less Catholic and more conservative. It's now led by Angela Merkel, not a Catholic. And if you look, you can actually look to change pretty quickly in the 60s, where in the 50s if you're thinking about European integration, you're thinking about Konrad Adenauer and Robert Schuman, who on the German and French sides, the 2 key figures. They speak literally a common language. They're both German speakers, and they're both Catholic. In the 60s, it's different. The Christian Democratic Party has changed. It's now led by Ludwig Erhard, a Protestant, and his antithesis, his partner in France is Charles de Gaulle, who was in fact Catholic, but was not at the head of a Christian Democratic Party. Certainly not. So the language of European federalism shifts away from Catholicism as well. So just to sum up really briefly, I want to say that it seems to me that if this were about Catholic politics in the past of Europe, it's interesting, that's what this has kind of become, there's a lot to say. And Catholic politics had a great influence on the past of Europe. But if you think about Catholic politics in the present and future of Europe, I'm not sure how much there is to say. I mean, it's not clear what the future of Europe will be, but it seems to me that Catholic politics will not play a large role in it. Okay, thank you.